In 1950, there was a week every month every Detroit factory family recognized without checking the calendar. The bread got harder. The butter dish looked emptier. Meals became quieter, stretched carefully across long days before payday. Dad's check was already gone, and Mom stood at the counter counting what remained. No panic. Just a skill passed down through generations, from coal towns, farms, and immigrant villages that knew how to survive hard weeks. She opened the cabinet, looked at what was left, and turned scraps into meals that kept exhausted families fed after brutal shifts at Ford, Chrysler, and Dodge. Not luxury, survival, and somehow love hidden inside every plate. Number 30. Kasha with onion and lard. In the Ukrainian and Polish neighborhoods stretching out from Hamtramck in the early 1950s, buckwheat groats cost less than a dime a pound. You toasted them dry in a cast-iron pan until they smelled like something between bread and earth. Then you cooked them in water with a heavy hand of salt. The onion went into the lard, rendered right there in the same pan, until it turned the color of old gold. You poured it over the kasha, and that was dinner. Nothing else needed. Nothing else available. Today, buckwheat is a health food. Specialty stores charge $4 for what fed a Polish family of 6 for 30 cents. Grandma just called it kasha. She never called it anything else. Number 29. Pork and beans on toast. A can of Van Camp's pork and beans cost 19 cents in 1955. Working-class Detroit families, black, white, Polish, Hungarian, it didn't matter, kept a case of them under the kitchen sink or in the basement cold room. But nobody ate them straight from the can. You heated them low with a spoonful of mustard, half an onion chopped fine, and a little splash of something sweet, molasses, or the syrup from a jar of pickles. Toasted white bread underneath. That was the plate. That was enough. It wasn't a can of beans dumped on bread. It was a hot meal made with intention, and there's a difference. Number 28. Lentil soup with smoked paprika. The Hungarian families in Delray kept smoked paprika the way other people kept salt. Always present, always reached for first. Lentils cost 8 cents a pound in the mid-1950s, and a pound made enough soup to last 3 days on the back of the stove. You started with lard and onion, added the lentils, poured in water, or the weak broth from a boiled bone, and finished with enough smoked paprika to turn the whole pot the color of a November sunset. No meat required. The lentils carried more protein per penny than a pork chop. That's not an opinion. That's chemistry. Hungarian grandmothers understood it by instinct 60 years before nutrition labels existed. Number 27. Chicken feet soup. Nothing left the kitchen. Nothing. In the black southern migrant communities along Detroit's east side and in the Polish households of the near northwest, chicken feet were not discarded. They were the point. You scalded them, peeled the outer skin, clipped the nails, and dropped them into a pot of cold water with onion and celery and black pepper and let them go for 3 hours. What came out was one of the most gelatin-rich broths a human body can consume, thick enough to set solid in the icebox overnight. Modern restaurants charge $14 for bone broth that doesn't come close. Grandma made it from the parts the butcher threw away. She was right. Everything she knew was right. Number 26. Stuffed peppers, lean version. When money was short, the stuffed peppers still appeared on the table, but they were honest about what they were. 1 pound of ground beef, maybe less, stretched across 8 peppers with 2 cups of rice and a can of tomatoes from the shelf. The meat was almost incidental, a flavor, not a foundation. Eastern European families across Detroit's factory neighborhoods made them this way every week before payday, and they tasted like love anyway because the pepper softened and sweetened in the oven and the tomato cooked down into something rich and the rice absorbed everything. Today a restaurant puts 1 stuffed pepper on a white plate and calls it an entree and charges $16. That is not progress. That is theater. Number 25. Cornmeal mush. This one worked twice. You made it at night. Cornmeal stirred into salted boiling water until it thickened into something you could eat with a spoon and a little butter, or molasses if the kids needed convincing. Families who'd come up from Tennessee and Georgia and Mississippi knew this by a different name. Families who'd crossed from Hungary knew it as Poliska. In the Italian neighborhoods around Gratiot Avenue, it was polenta, though nobody called it that, in a factory house in 1954. You fed the family dinner, then you poured the leftovers into a loaf pan and let it go cold overnight. In the morning it was solid. You sliced it, fried the slices in bacon grease until the outside crackled and browned, and that was breakfast. 1 pot of cornmeal. 2 meals. 2 cents a serving. Today we call it polenta, and charge $14 a plate at restaurants with exposed brick walls and a wine list. Here's what the food industry doesn't want you to know. The recipe has not changed by a single ingredient. Only the address changed. Only the zip code changed. Number 24. Chicken gizzard gravy. The gizzard bag came with every whole chicken. Some women threw it in the stock pot without thinking. The smarter ones, or the broker ones, depending on how you look at it, built a whole meal around it. You simmered the gizzards and hearts low and slow for 2 hours in salted water with a bay leaf and a little onion. They started tough. They ended tender, almost silky, the connective tissue broken down into something the cooking liquid absorbed. Then you made a roux. 2 tablespoons of lard, 2 tablespoons of flour, whisked together in a hot pan, and poured that cooking liquid in slowly until you had a thick, dark, serious gravy. Over biscuits, over white bread toasted in the oven, over rice if there was rice. This was not poor man's gravy. This was organ meat cookery that French cuisine spent 3 centuries developing under the name abats and charging accordingly. Factory wives in Detroit's Corktown and Poletown neighborhoods were doing it every week before payday for a 1/4 pound of gizzards that cost less than 30 cents. They knew things about extracting flavor from undervalued cuts that we will spend the next 50 years trying to remember. Number 23. Sardine sandwiches. The tin was flat and silver, and it lived in the back of every factory worker's lunch pail at some point. A can of King Oscar sardines cost 17 cents in 1956. You opened it with the little key, rolled back on the lid, drained the oil, saved it, always saved it, and laid the sardines on white bread with a heavy stripe of yellow mustard and a few rings of raw onion if there was an onion in the kitchen. That was lunch. That was sometimes dinner. Sardines in 1955 delivered more omega-3 fatty acids per serving than almost any food available to a working-class family. Calcium, vitamin D, complete protein, 17 cents. Nobody repackaged sardines and sold them back to us at a premium. The food industry just convinced us they were embarrassing, that a man who ate sardines from a tin was a man who couldn't afford better. That is not a nutritional opinion. That is a marketing decision made on purpose. Grandma just called them fish sandwiches. She had no embarrassment. She was right. Number 22. Pickled beet eggs. Pennsylvania Dutch families had carried this up through Ohio and into Detroit's outer neighborhoods, and once the Eastern European communities got hold of the idea, it spread through Hamtramck like a rumor. You boiled eggs until they were hard. You already had a jar of pickled beets, either store-bought at 9 cents a jar or put up yourself in August when beets were 3 cents a pound. You submerged the peeled eggs in the beet brine and left them in the icebox for 2 days. They came out the color of burgundy wine all the way through, tangy, firm, deeply flavored, a protein source, a shelf-stable snack, a way to stretch a meal with something that looked and tasted like it had required effort. It had, just not money. Number 21. Macaroni and butter, not macaroni and cheese. That came later in the blue box, once Kraft figured out how to sell you powdered cheese product and call it dinner. This was elbow macaroni, cooked past al dente, because nobody in a Detroit factory house in 1953 was cooking it al dente, drained and returned to the pot with a serious amount of butter and black pepper. That was it. Sometimes a little garlic powder, sometimes nothing at all. Italian families in the neighborhoods near Eastern Market had been eating pasta this way since before their grandparents left Calabria and Sicily. It was not a failure of imagination. It was a complete understanding of what fat and starch do together, how butter coats every surface of the pasta and carries the pepper into every bite. Here's what the food industry doesn't want you to know. Kraft launched its macaroni and cheese dinner in 1937, marketed directly at the Depression-era poor. By 1950, they had convinced an entire generation that the real version, butter, pasta, nothing else, was somehow less than the powdered version. They sold you a worse product and made you feel like it was an upgrade. That is not progress. That is one of the most successful con jobs in American food history. Number 20. Milk toast. You need to understand what this meal meant before you dismiss it. Milk toast was not a metaphor for weakness. It was what you made when someone was sick or scared, or when the money was so low that even the beans were gone and all you had was the heel of the bread and milk that needed to be used before it turned. You buttered the bread thick and toasted it in the oven, or on the stovetop in a dry pan if the oven was cold. You warmed the milk in a saucepan with a pinch of salt, sometimes sugar, sometimes nothing. You tore the toast into the warm milk and let it soften just enough that it still had some body left. Irish families in Corktown made it. Appalachian families who'd come north on Route 23 made it. Black families from Alabama made their version with cornbread instead of white bread and called it something different. It was warm. It was filling. It required almost nothing. And there is a tenderness in a mother making this for her children that no meal at any price has ever replaced. Number 19. Tomato soup cake. This sounds wrong. That is because you were taught to think about food in terms of what it costs and what it signals, not in terms of what it does. The recipe ran in community church cookbooks across the industrial Midwest, beginning in the late 1930s and continued well into the 1950s. A can of Campbell's condensed tomato soup, 14 cents, went into a spice cake batter in place of liquid and fat. The tomato you couldn't taste. What it left behind was moisture, lift, and a warm reddish crumb that stayed soft for 3 days. Cinnamon, nutmeg, a little flour, baking soda, raisins if you had them. Factory wives across Detroit made this for birthdays, for Sunday dessert, for the end of the week when there was nothing left but a can on the shelf and the need to make something that felt like celebration. It was genius. The food industry needed you to stop making it so you would buy box cake mix instead. By 1955, Betty Crocker and Pillsbury had convinced American women that making a cake from scratch, especially one that used a soup can, was somehow shameful, that a real homemaker used their product. She was right. Everything she knew was right. The soup can cake outlasted most of what those companies sold. Number 18. Potatoes fried in bacon grease. The grease can sat on the back of every stove, cast iron or old tin, it didn't matter. Every strip of bacon, every pork chop, every sausage link left something behind in the pan, and that something went into the can. When the money ran short, you reached for the can. Potatoes, 10 pounds for 25 cents in 1954. Sliced thin or cut into rough chunks laid into a cast iron pan with a spoonful of bacon grease already shimmering. Onion if there was one. Paprika in the Hungarian households. Salt. Black pepper. The lid on for the first 10 minutes so they steamed through, then the lid off so the bottoms browned and crisped against the iron. This was not a side dish. This was dinner. And it was a complete meal in ways that nutritionists are only now beginning to properly document. The fat from the drippings carrying fat-soluble vitamins from the potato skin, the resistant starch feeding gut bacteria in ways that a skinless baked potato at a chain restaurant simply does not. Grandma just called it fried potatoes. She made them without thinking. She was right. Number 17. Split pea soup with a ham bone. The bone came first. Easter ham, Christmas ham, a Sunday ham bought on sale. It didn't matter which. The meat got eaten, every slice of it, and what remained went into the freezer wrapped in butcher paper if there was a freezer, or into the cold room in the basement if there wasn't, and it waited there until the week before payday came again. One ham bone, a pound of split peas, 9 cents in 1955, an onion, 2 carrots if you had them, water, salt, black pepper, and thyme. You didn't need anything else. The bone gave the broth a smokiness that no bouillon cube has ever replicated. The peas broke down over 2 hours of slow cooking until the soup was thick enough to stand a spoon in. It fed a family of 5 for 2 days. Polish families made it. Hungarian families made it. The black Southern families who'd come up from Georgia made their version with field peas and a smoked neck bone instead. The technique was identical. The wisdom was identical. They knew things about making one ingredient do the work of 10 that we will spend the next 50 years trying to remember. Number 16. Dandelion green salad with hot bacon dressing. In April and May, the vacant lots of Detroit grew something valuable. Italian grandmothers knew it first. They called it cicoria, or dente di leon, and they walked out in the early morning with a paper bag and a paring knife and came back with enough dandelion greens for a meal. Polish and Hungarian women did the same thing, having grown up in places where foraging wasn't a hobby, it was April. You wilted the greens slightly with a hot dressing made from rendered bacon, cider vinegar, a little sugar, and the fat from the pan. The bitterness of the dandelion cut against the acid and the salt of the bacon in a way that was not an accident. It was the product of generations of people who understood how flavors balance without having read a single word about it. Dandelion greens carry more calcium per ounce than milk, more iron than spinach. They were free. They were growing 20 feet from the back door. Today we call them a wellness superfood and sell them at Whole Foods for $4.99 a bunch. Here's what the food industry doesn't want you to know. They were always a superfood. They just grew in neighborhoods that didn't have Whole Foods. Number 15. Grease bread. You already know about the grease can. But there was a simpler application than fried potatoes. One that required nothing but bread and whatever had settled in that can since the last time you cooked something with pork. You spread the drippings on white bread the way another family might spread butter. The fat was already seasoned. It had absorbed smoke and salt and the memory of every meal that had passed through that pan. You ate it at the kitchen table, sometimes with a cup of coffee that was more chicory than coffee, and that was breakfast before the early shift. This was not poverty on a plate. This was fat-soluble flavor delivery that cost nothing and required nothing beyond the habit of not throwing things away. The habit of not throwing things away is the single most important thing those kitchens ever taught, and it is the single thing the food industry needed most desperately to kill. Waste is profit. The grease can was the enemy of waste. She kept it anyway. Number 14. Fried egg sandwich. The egg was the great leveler of the pre-payday kitchen. A dozen eggs cost 41 cents in 1956 Detroit. That's 3.5 cents per egg. You fried it in whatever fat was in the pan, a little butter if you had it, bacon grease from the can if you didn't, and you laid it on white bread with yellow mustard and sometimes a slice of raw onion and sometimes nothing at all. That was lunch. Packed into a wax paper sleeve and put in the lunch pail for the early shift. Or eaten standing at the kitchen counter before the walk to the bus stop at 5:30 in the morning. It was protein. It was fat. It was a complete amino acid profile for 3.5 cents. It required 4 minutes. The egg sandwich did not need to be reinvented. It did not need an artisan brioche bun and a smear of truffle aioli. Every diner in America that charges $12 for a breakfast sandwich is selling you back something that factory families in Detroit ate without ceremony for 30 years because it worked. It always worked. Number 13. Oatmeal for dinner. This one is harder to explain to people who grew up with enough. Oatmeal was not a breakfast food. It was a cheap food. And cheap food gets eaten when you need it, not when the clock says you're supposed to. A 5-pound canister of Quaker rolled oats cost 33 cents in 1954. Families from the Appalachian coal towns of eastern Kentucky and West Virginia, who had come north in enormous numbers after the war to work the Detroit plants, had eaten oatmeal at any hour for generations. You made it thick with salt, and you put butter on it if there was butter and nothing on it if there wasn't. Molasses if the kids needed something to make it go down. It was dinner, a bowl of it, with maybe a piece of day-old bread from the baker on the corner who sold yesterday's loaves at half price after 4 o'clock. No one apologized for it. You set it on the table, and you ate it, and you were grateful for the warmth of it, and you didn't discuss what it meant that you were eating oatmeal at 6:30 on a Thursday night, because Dad's check didn't come until Friday. Number 12. Neck bones and Rice the Black Southern families who'd made the Great Migration north from Alabama, Mississippi, Georgia, Arkansas, brought this with them in the bones of their knowledge the same way they brought everything else, completely and without apology. Neck bones cost almost nothing in 1950s Detroit. The butcher on Hastings Street on the east side sold them by the pound for a few cents because the white customers didn't ask for them. That was their loss. You put the neck bones in cold water and brought them up slow with onion and celery and black pepper and let them simmer for 3 hours. The meat, and there was meat, sweet and close to the bone, the best kind, pulled free with a fork. The broth went over rice. The bones went back in the pot for a second round, if there was a second round needed. This fed a family of 5. It cost under $1 for all of it. It took an afternoon of slow heat. Here's what the food industry doesn't want you to know. Collagen-rich bone broth from cuts like neck bones has been validated by modern nutritional science as one of the most bioavailable sources of glycine and proline available in a human diet. Upscale restaurants now sell neck bones as a delicacy. The East Side families eating them in 1952 didn't need a menu to tell them they were worth something. Number 11. Egg drop soup, Detroit style, not the Chinese restaurant version, though that version is its own kind of genius. This was what you made when the chicken was gone and only the carcass remained. You covered it with cold water, carcass, neck, whatever scraps clung to the bones, and you boiled it down for 2 hours with an onion cut in half and a few peppercorns if you had them. You strained it. You brought the broth back to a simmer. Then you cracked 2 eggs into a bowl, beat them with a fork, and poured them in a thin, slow stream into the simmering broth while stirring. The eggs set immediately in long, pale ribbons throughout the liquid. You salted it. You ladled it into bowls. You served it with crackers or with yesterday's bread. This was dinner for 4 from 1 chicken carcass and 2 eggs. Polish grandmothers made it. Hungarian grandmothers made it. A chicken in 1954 cost 69 cents whole. You got 3 meals from it: the roasted chicken, the soup from the carcass, and the egg drop broth from whatever remained. Nothing, not 1 calorie, went to waste. Number 10. Kapusta sauerkraut was not a condiment in the Polish and Hungarian households of Hamtramck and Delray. It was a vegetable, a main ingredient, sometimes the main ingredient. Kapusta, braised sauerkraut with whatever pork scraps were available, could mean the end of the pork chop bones, or the last of the fatback, or nothing at all if nothing was left. You cooked the sauerkraut down low in a little lard with onion and caraway seed until the sharpness mellowed and the liquid reduced and the whole thing turned a deep, complex, funky gold. Meat was added if it existed. It wasn't required over boiled potatoes, over dark bread, by itself in a bowl. Fermented cabbage contains more vitamin C per serving than an orange. It was the thing that kept northern and eastern European communities from scurvy during long winters for 500 years before anyone had a word for vitamin C. The grandmothers who packed the crocks in August understood this the way birds understand migration, not as science, but as something deeper than science. Number 9. Pinto bean pie, not a dessert. Let that land first. The Appalachian families who'd come north on Route 23 from eastern Kentucky brought this with them. and it confused everyone outside their community and nourished everyone inside it. A savory pie, sometimes with a lard crust, sometimes just a bottom crust to make it go further, filled with cooked pinto beans, seasoned with salt and pork fat, and sometimes a little onion. Baked until the filling set, it sliced, it held, it was portable. A pound of dried pinto beans cost 8 cents in 1955. The pie fed 6 people for 2 meals. The protein density of a single serving exceeded what you'd get from a beef dish 3 times its cost. Nobody outside Appalachian communities knew this meal existed. The families who made it did not advertise it. They just ate it and survived and kept their knowledge close. Grandma just called it bean pie. She didn't need your approval. She was right. Number 8. Fried bologna. This one needs no apology and no explanation, but it's going to get both. You took a thick slice, not the thin paper-shaved deli version, but a real slice, a 1/4 inch at least, and you cut 2 or 3 slits through the edge so it wouldn't curl up in the pan and buckle into a dome. Into the cast iron skillet on medium-high heat with a little grease, and you let it go until the edges browned and the center blistered and the whole kitchen smelled like the thing a hungry person needs a kitchen to smell like. On white bread with yellow mustard, sometimes with a fried egg on top if the week was going reasonably well. Bologna was the working man's steak. In Detroit's factory neighborhoods in the 1950s, a pound of bologna cost 29 cents. It was protein and fat and salt, and it satisfied something deep and physical that a day on the assembly line at Dodge, Maine created. The food industry spent 30 years making bologna a punchline, a synonym for cheap, for low class, for the thing you ate when you couldn't afford real food. That is not a nutritional opinion. That is class contempt dressed up as consumer preference. The families who ate fried bologna sandwiches on a Tuesday night 4 days before payday were not eating poorly. They were eating what they had with skill, and it tasted exactly like it needed to taste. Number 7. Cornbread and beans. This needs to be said plainly. This was not a side dish combination. This was a complete food system carried out of the American South by the hundreds of thousands of black families who settled in Detroit between 1940 and 1960 and built the city's industrial workforce alongside everyone else. Pinto beans or navy beans. Slow cooked with onion, salt pork, and black pepper for 4 to 5 hours until the liquid thickened into something halfway between broth and gravy. Cornbread made in a cast iron skillet, fine ground cornmeal, buttermilk, 1 egg, bacon fat in the pan before the batter goes in so the bottom crust sears immediately. You crumbled the cornbread into the beans, or you ate them separately, or you used the cornbread to scoop. There was no wrong method. A pound of dried beans cost 10 cents in 1955. A cup of cornmeal cost 3 cents. This meal fed a family of 5 for 2 days. The protein combination of legume and grain forms a complete amino acid profile. Food scientists confirmed this in the 1970s. The black Southern grandmothers who made this meal every week before payday had confirmed it in practice 200 years earlier. They knew things about complete nutrition from incomplete ingredients that we will spend the next 50 years trying to remember. Number 6. Potato pancakes in Hamtramck, the Polish enclave so dense it was its own city inside Detroit. Plaki ziemniaczane were not a brunch item or a Hanukkah tradition imported from somewhere else. They were Tuesday night. They were the money ran out night. They were the night before payday. Raw potatoes grated on the box grater. Your knuckles learned to stay away from the sharp side over years of practice. Squeeze dry in a dish towel so the water came out and the starch remained. 1 egg. A little flour, salt and pepper. Into the lard in the cast iron pan, pressed flat, cooked until the edges went lace crisp and the center cooked through. You ate them with sour cream, if there was sour cream, with applesauce, if there were apples, with nothing at all, if neither was available. A 5-pound bag of potatoes cost 22 cents in 1954. It made enough pancakes for a family of 6 with potatoes left over for breakfast. Today we call them lax on a menu and charge $13 for 4 of them garnished with creme fraiche. Grandma made them in a house dress at 6 o'clock on a Wednesday evening for 22 cents and fed everyone and thought nothing more of it. Number 5. Stuffed cabbage. The week before payday, the Golubki told the truth about the week. When money was comfortable, the filling was half meat, half rice. When money was short, the ratio flipped. And short weeks, the filling was barely seasoned ground pork or beef, more rice than you'd admit to, stretched across 12 cabbage leaves from a head that cost 9 cents. You boiled the cabbage until the leaves peeled back pliable and forgiving. You rolled the filling in tight, tucked the ends under, laid them seam down in a heavy pot with canned tomatoes and a little water. You cooked them covered for 2 hours on the lowest flame the stove had. The cabbage sweetened, the tomato deepened, the rice swelled and absorbed everything. And here is the thing, the lean version, the rice-heavy, meat-light version, tasted just as deep as the rich version. Deeper, sometimes, because the cabbage and tomato had to carry more of the weight and they rose to it. Polish and Hungarian and Czech women across Detroit's factory neighborhoods made this every week. It kept for 3 days. It fed everyone. $1 of ingredients. A full pot. Number 4. Bean soup with ham hocks. The ham hock cost 19 cents at the Eastern Market Butcher in 1955. A pound of dried navy beans cost 10 cents. Together with an onion and 2 stalks of celery and a bay leaf and enough water to cover everything by 4 inches, they made a soup that simmered on the back burner all day while the early shift workers slept, and the late shift workers dressed, and the kids came home from Pulaski High School and Pershing High School and Holy Redeemer and dropped their books on the kitchen table and stood over the pot and inhaled. The hock gave the beans a smokiness that went all the way through. The beans gave the broth a body that no stock cube has ever equaled. After 3 hours, the beans broke down at the edges and thickened the liquid without any flour, without any technique. Just time and low heat, doing what time and low heat have always done. This fed a family of 6 for 2 days, 29 cents. Every ethnic community in Detroit made a version of this soup. Polish, Black Southern, Italian, Hungarian, Irish. The ingredients shifted by a spice or a bean variety. The wisdom was identical across all of them. Feed the family. Waste nothing. Make the cheap thing taste like something worth sitting down for. Number 3. Fatback with white gravy. The fatback was the cheapest cut at the butcher, a pound for 12 cents in 1953. Pure fat with a thin streak of meat running through it, salted and sometimes smoked, sold in paper packages that sweated through by the time you got it home. You sliced it thin and fried it in its own rendering fat until the pieces were crisp at the edges and the pan had a 1/4 inch of hot white lard in it. Then the gravy. A spoonful of flour into the hot fat stirred fast until it turned the color of straw. Then milk poured in gradually while you kept stirring, white pepper, salt, nothing else, until it thickened into something pale and serious that smelled like the inside of a diner at 6 in the morning. Over biscuits, over white bread, over whatever was on the table. The Appalachian families from Kentucky and West Virginia who'd come north knew this meal the way they knew their own names. It was called different things in different counties. Sawmill gravy, white gravy, milk gravy, but it was the same knowledge. A pound of fatback, a cup of milk, a spoonful of flour. Fed 4 people, 12 cents for the meat. That is not poor food. That is precision. That is knowing exactly how to turn 12 cents of pork fat and a cup of milk into a meal that sticks to your ribs until the next shift ends. Number 2. Macaroni and tomato. This is not macaroni and cheese. This is not pasta with marinara. This is not Italian-American. This is something older and more American than any of those things, and it deserves to be named correctly. Elbow macaroni, cooked, drained. A can of whole peeled tomatoes, 14 cents in 1956, crushed by hand over the pot. A heavy spoonful of butter, salt, black pepper, sometimes a little sugar if the tomatoes were acidic. simmered together for 10 minutes until the pasta absorbed the tomato and the liquid reduced and every elbow was coated in something orange-red and warm and deeply, quietly perfect. This was made in black households and white households and Polish households and Hungarian households. It crossed every ethnic boundary in Detroit's factory neighborhoods because it required nothing that anyone didn't have. Pasta, tomatoes, butter, thyme. It was not a compromise. It was not a lesser version of something more expensive. It was a complete thing, a finished thing. Here's what the food industry doesn't want you to know. Hamburger Helper launched in 1971 precisely to replace this dish. General Mills saw that working-class families were still making macaroni and tomato from scratch, still buying the ingredients separately, and designed a product that cost more, delivered less nutrition, and required a pound of ground beef that jacked the price up further. They marketed it as easier. It was not easier. It was a pan of macaroni and canned tomatoes. The women of Detroit had been doing it in 15 minutes for 20 years. Number 1. Bread and lard, you start here. You end here. Because this is where the week before payday always ended up, eventually, if it went on long enough. A loaf of white bread cost 16 cents in 1955 Detroit. Lard cost 29 cents a pound and lasted weeks. You cut the bread. You spread the lard with a knife the same way you'd spread butter. And in the Polish and Hungarian households of Hamtramck, it sometimes was butter, salt butter, pressed into a crock, and in the poorer weeks it was pure lard, white and cold from the icebox, spreading thicker than butter, leaving a shine on the bread that disappeared into the crumb. Sometimes garlic rubbed on first, sometimes a pinch of salt pressed into the fat, sometimes nothing. That was it. That was the meal. And I need you to sit with that for a moment, because there is a tendency to look at bread and lard and see deprivation, to see a family that failed to have enough, to measure the distance between bread and lard and a full refrigerator and call that distance poverty. But the women who made it didn't see it that way. They saw bread, good bread, yeasty and white and baked that morning or the morning before. They saw fat, rendered fat, that carried the memory of every meal it came from. They saw their children eating. They saw the table covered and the family seated and the day ending the way a day is supposed to end, together with food in front of everyone. Lard, it turns out, has a higher smoke point than most vegetable oils and a fatty acid profile closer to olive oil than to the saturated fat nightmare the food industry told you it was in 1961. The American Heart Association's campaign against lard, beginning in the late 1950s, funded substantially by the vegetable shortening industry, which had a product to sell, replaced lard in American kitchens with hydrogenated vegetable oils that we now know were far more dangerous than what they replaced. That is not a footnote. That is one of the most consequential nutritional betrayals in American history. The women spreading lard on bread in Hamtramck in 1955 were eating something safer than what the experts were about to tell them to eat instead. She was right. Everything she knew was right. And they made her feel ashamed of it anyway. Closing, fry the bologna. Make the macaroni and tomato. Spread the lard on the bread and eat it at your kitchen table without apology. Because the women who built these meals were not making do. They were not surviving. They were cooking with precision and knowledge and love and the kind of intelligence that doesn't come from cookbooks. It comes from necessity, which is the only teacher that never lies. They stood at 4-burner stoves in Hamtramck and Delray and on Detroit's east side and in Corktown, and they fed families on 30 cents and 20 cents and 10 cents and sometimes less, and nobody called them chefs, and nobody called it cuisine, and nobody wrote it down because it didn't need to be written down. It was passed hand to hand, daughter to daughter, neighbor to neighbor, across back fences and church basements and factory break rooms. And then the food industry came with its $14 million advertising budgets and its powdered cheese and its helper and its promise that modern women didn't cook like their mothers anymore, and in one generation one single generation, most of it was gone. Not because it stopped working. It still works. Every recipe in this video still works. Not because it stopped tasting good. It still tastes like something real, because they made her ashamed of it. That is the only reason. Shame. Deployed deliberately by companies with budgets and boardrooms and a product to move. That is not progress. That is theft. And the thing that was stolen was not just a recipe. It was a complete way of knowing how to feed people with almost nothing and make them feel like they had everything. Comment below and tell me which one your grandmother made. Tell me what she called it. Tell me what it smelled like. Because that knowledge belongs here with all of us, and it is not gone yet.